So the question that Chris asked us to think about was, what should a public policy chew on? And my answer, I don't think this will surprise Chris, is to say I think a very important question for a public policy to chew on is the political consequences of inequality. And so this was an interesting debate in recent years, but now it is the daily clown show. And the political consequences of inequality are playing out, on Twitter every day, with the clown having access to nuclear clothes. And so this issue of what are the political consequences of inequality couldn't be more serious. And I think what underlies what is often ridiculous is the consequences of decisions that have been made over many years by many governments of all stripes to lean heavily into austerity and into regressive tax policies have helped build an army of the dislocated and the disenfranchised who are increasingly open to arguments by racist populists that are beginning to undermine democracy all around the world. And I think it is a topic that is sufficiently important that it calls for soul-searching by everybody in the rest of the political system. So people on the blue team who, in many ways have had it all their own way for a generation now, I think need to do some serious soul-searching. Say, look at the political consequences of these policies as played out in the United States most emphatically, but in the rise of an almost explicitly neo-fascist party in Germany, in the political outcome that has just happened in Austria, in the regionalist divisions that are arising in Italy, in the Brexit vote. And think about, are we happy with how this is playing out? Is this what we were after in pursuing these policies? Should we maybe consider what the consequences of creating this army of the dispossessed who are disengaging from the political system overall and are open to these ugly populist arguments? Is there something about what we have been doing when we have had it all our own way for so long that needs to change? And as for folks from my political tradition, from the progressive side, we too have at least as big a soul search to go on, because you would think that in this environment, with these outcomes, that it would be a wonderful time for progressives in every democratic jurisdiction in the world. You would think, look at these consequences, and that the victory would fall in laps. And indeed, if you look at the early aughts, the Social Democrats were on the ascendant all around the world. And yet, in part, because our own governments followed many of these policies, it hasn't been a happy hunting ground for progressives around the world, and progressives need to think seriously about that. What's wrong with us that in what should be a perfect environment for progressive arguments, that isn't always turning out to be the case at the time at all? So these are very interesting topics in which everyone in the, if we call it the non-populist political spectrum, has got some serious soul-searching to do. And what better place than in a public policy school? Now, that said, I don't want to paint it too darkly, and you can't be in Montreal this week and be too negative. That was an absolutely beautiful win by my good friend and colleague on the Broadbent Institute board, Valérie Plante, who was a wonderful politician, a sunny, optimistic, smiling, great progressive woman who just, I don't want to in this be too negative about Mayor Coderre, who's in his own ways an interesting guy, but that was a beautiful, beautiful win by Valérie and by her party, who were full, young, interesting people, millennials showing what they're going to be able to do as they move over in Montreal. And so then there's another call on public policy schools, which is when you have such a great government that has been elected, it needs to succeed. And so the challenges that it is going to face as it thinks about trying to give life into these inspiring commitments that Valérie made, which have, if I may say, coming out of the Notley government, have a bit of a familiar ring to them, that she needs to succeed. Because we need to consider what the consequences are when those kind of hopes are dashed through failure. So there is much to do, and I just want to wrap up by saying that at the end of the day, if I'm saying, the rising army of the dispossessed is a big problem, then we need to do something about that, which gets us into the question of how can we achieve, a more sustainable prosperity that is much more widely shared, which is another critical issue. And when we were talking about Canada, which is, and this is where Chris gets to laugh for a minute, you'll see, which is 20% of its exports are petroleum, and 10% more are automobiles which burn petroleum. then when we ask ourselves, in Canada, how do we achieve a more sustainable prosperity that is much more widely shared, then we are into this very interesting issue of how does Canada in the future develop its resources in balance with action on climate change and the environment pressures that lie before us. And so it's another very, very interesting public policy issue that has at its heart not just how do you make the Canadian economy work in the future, but how do you make it work for more people.